Thank you very much for inviting me to have the opportunity to speak here. Especially thanks to Sanja Kalkin from Platform INS in the Netherlands. I am from the Netherlands. And to Semre Ulker of the Journalists and Writers Foundation. Well, as our chairperson already said, I am a philosopher. So my talk will have a bit of an abstract level, and it's fitting, I think, that I start and then the real concrete stuff comes in afterwards, which is really interesting. And I'm looking forward to listening to the different stories and experiences. But let me start with, let me see whether this works. Yeah, it does. Let me start with a kind of a provocative statement. Namely that I think we do not live in a world of shared values. We would like to have that, but diversity in this globalized world means that we are having to deal with a plurality of values. That's a fact. Different people harbor different values, and more so, stronger even, these values may conflict, they may collide, and that's also a fact of human life. For instance, freedom. I think a lot of us would say, yes, freedom is a very important value or principle, but I guess that we are not thinking among ourselves the same about what to do with that freedom. This is Calvin and Hobbes' cartoon where the small Calvin says, I've got all the freedom of the world. And what is he doing? Well, he knows no better way than squandering it watching cartoons all day. That's his way of, that's what he values. Well, perhaps we disagree about that. So there are other values like justice. We would all agree that justice is very important, but what do we mean by it? Is it equality of opportunity? Is it equality of outcome? Is it each according to his merits? Is it each according to his needs? We have huge discussions about that. So in order to live with this plurality of values, I think, and this is one of my statements, that we should not only aim at preventing conflicts, because there are conflicts, but that we have to deal with them, we have to regulate them in a peaceful way. And for that, we need to have a democratic culture. So not only democratic governments, but a culture beneath that sustains that form of government. And in order to have a viable democratic culture, we need citizens with democratic virtues. And that's what I want to talk about, these democratic virtues. In my mind, there are two crucial virtues for people living in a democratic culture. And these are assertiveness and tolerance. And these are two very different virtues, because if you are assertive, you can do that with people who are familiar to you. But tolerance is needed to live among strangers. To have assertiveness, you have certainty. You can live with certainty. But tolerance is all about living with uncertainty. So I want to elaborate on these two virtues with you. So the democratic virtue of assertiveness, you can look at three aspects of this virtue. In the first place, it is the ability to stand up for your own rights, to be assertive in that sense. In the second sense, it's a bit more ordinary kind of virtue or competence, so you will, if you will, that is the ability to bicker. So to fend off if people make a nasty joke about you, that you're not becoming timid, but that you strike back, so to speak, with words, of course. And especially if you're living in a big city, like I live in Amsterdam, but also New York City, then you need that ability to bicker from time to time. Oh, you recognize it. And the third is very important also. That's the ability to be able to question values and norms of others and advocate your own, no matter what the people in your environment think. The second virtue is that of tolerance. And you might notice that assertiveness and tolerance, there's a tension between these two. These are two very different virtues. They ask very different things. And tolerance is even more difficult, because tolerance sets you for a paradoxical task. Because what is one of the definitions of tolerance that I like? It is to be able and willing to allow something that on reasonable grounds you reject. So that's even, let's say, a riddle. How can you, if you think that something is rejectable for very good reasons, you think yourself, still accept or tolerate that? How can that ever be a virtue? It sounds that it's not a virtue. Therefore, I have distinguished between 3 levels of tolerance, so you will. And in the Dutch language, we have various different words for the word tolerance, which is not there in English, but I try to make translations, of course. So the first kind of tolerance that I distinguish is what I call permissiveness, but in Dutch it is called gedogen. Well, you can try with all these G's to pronounce it, but and permissiveness, that's what happens when someone, or most of the time a government, has all the power to suppress a certain practice, and even for moral reasons thinks this practice is wrong, but still permits it. Now, for instance, in Holland you have the toleration policy on soft drugs. It is not legal in the Netherlands to use soft drugs. A lot of people think that, but that's not true. But it is tolerated because the government thinks it is better to tolerate it and then still have some control on it rather than forbid it. With prostitution, it has gone the other way in the Netherlands. First, prostitution was tolerated, so a lot of people thought it was possible by law, but until 2000 it was only tolerated, and in 2000 it became legalized, which has its own problems. But either way, you see that Dutch government, hence the majority of Dutch people, have moral problems with drugs use or prostitution, and they struggle about how to deal with it. And this is a way to do it with permissiveness. The second kind of toleration is what I call forbearance. In Dutch we would say verdraagzaamheid. And this is more about people among one another, and it is about how sometimes you really hate something another people thinks or does, but you decide to tolerate it for most of the time pragmatic or important reasons. Pragmatic reasons like this relationship with this person is very important to me. Or, well, yes, I think his or her faith is wrong, but as I know that faith only comes from the inside, I cannot force this person to think otherwise anyhow, so I'd better tolerate it. And the third part is, third aspect is indulgence. It's the most easiest form of tolerance. Like, for instance, I am an atheist, but if a good friend of mine would want to marry in church and me have as a witness, I would say, okay, it's important for you, of course I will do this. That's indulgence. Now, there's a problem with virtues. In the virtue ethics of Aristotle already indicates is there's always, you can have too little of it or too much. So if you have too little of tolerance, then it's bigotry. But if there's too much of tolerance, then it becomes indifference. And the same with assertiveness. If there's too little, there's docility or timidity. But if there's too much, there's intimidation. So the question is, and I think in Western democracies, I don't know, I think in different countries the worries, the concerns will be different. But in Western democracies, the concerns are with the too much. In a society with growing and increasing diversity. So the question then becomes, when does tolerance turn into indifference? Or when does assertiveness turn into intimidation? What is the criterion here? What are the limits of tolerance or assertiveness? And my suggestion would be that the greatest vice, so that's the criterion, would be physical and moral cruelty. Now, if we talk about physical cruelty, I think we all can agree that you don't want to, you shouldn't physically hurt other persons. But moral cruelty is something else, and we haven't thought about that all the time. You could say that when individuals are treated as if they are an animal, an object, or a number, there's the committance of moral cruelty or humiliation. They are humiliated. And if you're humiliated, this gives you good reasons to feel harmed in your sense of self-respect. So this is important. For instance, this is a picture taken quite a while ago by a female Israeli soldier who had taken hostage two Palestinian guys and put this on Facebook and then said underneath she had the most wonderful time when she was in the army. So there's two things happening at the same time, the humiliation of the guy sitting there and then the extra humiliation of her putting the picture on Facebook. So the complicated thing for me is that I'm repeating this now, and for critical reasons, but still I'm repeating the humiliation itself, so I want to get rid of it as soon as possible. This is just to give you one example. So humiliation or moral cruelty is the criterion, I think, for when tolerance turns into indifference or assertiveness turns into intimidation. And this is only an idea of how what a decent society should look like. It should avoid cruelty by its laws and institutions. And if it would be a civil society, citizens among one another would do this too. This is an idea that I got for the Israeli philosopher Avishai Margalit in his book, A Decent Society. And what is very important here is that when you have the ideal of a just society, it is only allowed for citizens within that society. Margalit emphasizes that decency and civility are owed also to non-members of that society. For instance, illegal residents, asylum seekers, refugees, who are not members, who are not officially citizens of that society. So assertiveness turns into intimidation if this happens, and words can also hurt. Words can also be hurtful. And tolerance, and I think this is a very nice picture because you see the blonde woman look at the woman in the hijab, and I think she was reading The Guardian, so it must be in the London tube. But you see that she's like, oh, I don't feel comfortable about this, but of course she's here, she's my co-citizen and fellow traveler. But if you see something or hear something that is humiliating to another and you don't say anything, you don't stand up, then that's indifference, then it's not tolerance anymore. Okay, now there's one last thing. I don't know, do I have time? Yeah? Okay, fine, great. One point for discussion that I think that humiliation, you can also do that to yourself. You can also, for instance, have the idea, like women can have the idea that they deserve punishment or abuse by their husband because they themselves were wrong. That is a way, if you go along with that, it is self-denigrating. That is humiliating to yourself. So in these cases, I would say, neither tolerance nor indifference is the way to go, but what I call sympathetic distrust. So you would then, either as a person, a friend for instance, or as a policymaker or a social worker or a lawmaker say, I sympathize with you, but I think your ideas about what is for your own best, I don't agree with that is really for your own good. And they would nudge such a person into thinking otherwise or making measures to change her position nevertheless, although she thinks this is the right thing to do. So this is where you carefully have to think, I can't force this person to think otherwise about herself, but I can't remain indifferent either. Now, these were the ideas that I wanted to share with you. I give you greetings from the Netherlands, from my three granddaughters, of whom I'm very proud. Neither of them is my biological offspring, but Donna Haraway, one of my favorite philosophers, once said, don't make babies, or make kin, not babies. So I'm making kin with these 3 lovely girls. I want to thank you for your attention. Thank you.